I'm Rich Lowry with National Review, and I'm joined today by Jonathan Rauch.
Hi everyone, Jonathan Rauch. I'm a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution and a contributing editor of National Journal magazine.
So Jonathan, everyone is in Washington and the financial markets is consumed with this debt crisis showdown, and we are probably very likely to be overtaken by events in one form or another. But what has been your big takeaway so far?
Well, I have never seen it come this close, Rich. I've been writing in and around Washington on the budget for 30 years. I watched Graham Redmond go through. I've never seen anything like this. I'm worried sick about it. I think it's very possible we'll get up to the deadline and President Obama will have to make a terrible decision about whether to do something that could reduce our debt rating or possibly even default. I think if it comes to that, I think he should invoke the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and keep servicing the debt and keep spending as the law requires. But I think it's a crisis for the country, potentially. I also think right now it's a crisis for the conservative movement and the Republican Party, even though I don't think they realize it yet. What's your take?
I'm a little less dire than you are. I assume something's going to happen in one form or the other. Either some amalgam of the Boehner plan and the Reed plan, and of course the whispering was that they actually had some sort of agreement before that the White House swooped in and told Reed that anything less than a full extension past the election was unacceptable. And if you look at the structure of the two plans, they're not really that dissimilar. So if Boehner can get it through the House, you can see the makings of a deal there. Now, if that deal falls through and if there's just a recalcitrant caucus among House conservatives who just aren't willing to vote for anything in any shape or form, well, then I think you would see the Senate Republicans collapse very quickly. I think you'd see Reed and McConnell come up with some sort of stopgap plan. I assume you'd see Boehner favoring that stopgap plan and working with Democrats in the House to make it happen. Now, that would be a meltdown scenario for John Boehner's speakership, but I still think you would see the debt limit raised. Now, let me ask you on the 14th Amendment, because there are a lot of people who really strongly object to that notion, and they argue that the 14th Amendment means to honor the debts we already have, but doesn't mean you can just automatically start incurring new debt.
Well, actually, before getting to that, just a comment on
Sure.
the scenario you outlined. You know, it could happen. The problems are first where we're just running out of time, and it takes a while to do stuff around here. And we're down to what, 5 days, 6 days? And second, it's just not clear to me that Boehner's got the votes in his caucus for anything at all. So if doing this without Republican votes in the House, it's really tough. You might be right. But I'm not, I'm scared. 14th Amendment. Okay, so the 14th Amendment says that you're not allowed to question the national debt. This was put in after the Civil War to stop the former Confederate states from repudiating the national debt. Clearly, it's written by people who said meeting our debt obligations rises to a constitutional burden. Some people say, as you mentioned, they say, okay, well, that just means that if we run down to the wire, government keeps paying interest on the national debt, but the Social Security checks stop. Problem with that is the way Congress spends money is by passing laws, right? So we've got a conflict of statute here. We've got like 1,000 or 10,000 laws or whatever on the books saying this is an obligation, you have to spend it. We got the Impoundment Act, which says the president can't pick and choose, we have to spend. We have litigation on the line item veto, which the court said the president can't pick and choose, he has to spend. So you've got all those laws on one side. On the other side, you've got an arbitrary debt limit that says never mind all those other laws. If I'm Obama, I'm saying I'm not going to cause a completely artificial international crisis. That's not my constitutional role. Not going to do it, so sue me.
Well, that would be interesting. We might get an impeachment crisis on top of our debt crisis.
I think Obama,
a perfect storm.
Yeah, I think if Obama goes to court on that, or if he's taken to court, first the courts probably don't hear it because they resolve it they look at it as a political dispute.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see Republicans try to go to court or impeach Obama for preventing an international crisis and meeting the country's obligations.
So would President Obama then just spend above the debt limit and say this is my obligation because Congress has authorized this spending, and this
that's what I would do. That's what I would do. Now he said he's not going to do that for whatever reason. I don't understand why he put that off the table. I guess it's to keep pressure on Congress to come up with a solution, because if he says I'm going to deal with it, they don't have to. But if I were him, I would have just kept my mouth shut about it, kept the option in my pocket, and when push comes to shove, I would have kept spending. What would you do?
Well, I think he has, in your kind of nightmare scenario, he has a much easier break the glass option, which just say, okay, I'm all right with the short-term extension. And you could certainly get that through the Senate. You could certainly get Boehner on board with it, and even if, almost every Republican, even if he loses 60% of the House caucus, Republican caucus on that, he's going to get Democrats if Obama says he wants it. So I just see a lot of options preventing us from going over the precipice on this. Now there are certain House conservatives who I think have had a deeply naive view of how much leverage they had and have in this dispute, and a deeply naive view about what the political landscape will look like when we get past the deadline, whatever it is. And there's been some reporting lately that actually maybe more August 9th or 10th, but you do eventually run up against some real deadline. And there is a sentiment among House conservatives thinking that if you push it beyond the deadline, the day after, all of a sudden the Democrats are going to cry uncle, and they're going to come along and support a balanced budget amendment. And they're not going to just support any balanced budget amendment. They're going to support a version of the conservatives' balanced budget amendment in the House, which includes a spending limit. So what they basically believe is that if they push this past a deadline, they won't get blamed. All the pressure will be on the Democrats, and the Democrats will then kind of sign a suicide note, in effect, by acquiescing to a constitutional amendment that will enshrine conservative fiscal policy goals into the Constitution forevermore if it's ratified by the states.
And I take it you agree with me.
Deeply unrealistic scenario.
I agree. It's deeply unrealistic. But what worries me more about that than that the tactics I think are unrealistic is I think a lot of Republicans and a lot of conservatives don't care if the tactics are realistic. They've decided compromise is what got us in this mess to begin with. They are never compromising on principle again, period. That worries me pretty deeply, and it's a place where I'm particularly interested in your perspective, Rich, because you are editing the greatest and most important conservative magazine in the country, and the ones that in the days of William F. Buckley pushed Birchers and Randians and other anti-compromise extremists out of the conservative movement. I don't see mainstream conservatives today, most conservatives, by the way, are not Tea Partiers, saying, grow up, guys. This is not the way you run a party or a movement. There is nothing conservative about this almost nihilistic radicalism we're seeing. I would love to see National Review, for example, or other conservatives call for a different kind of approach, an approach more sensitive to governing and the realities of life. Maybe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's a lot there. First of all, I think in any way, shape, or form, comparing conservatives in the House to Birchers is deeply unfair. I mean, because these aren't paranoid people who are alleging grand conspiracy theories that are just totally outside the bounds of rational thought.
I agree on that. So I didn't mean to suggest the ideas have any parallel.
Gotcha.
Okay.
And this is, if you don't mind, a little historical disquisition, because you were mentioning the 14th Amendment and the Civil War. I've been I'm working on a project related to Lincoln, so I've been doing a lot of reading about Lincoln and that era. And what conservatives are after is really a transformational change in the nature of our government. And I think if you look at the rise of Lincoln and the Republican Party initially, you see how you actually achieve that kind of change. And it involves really two wings or two dispositions, if you will. Lincoln, he grew up in when he was a kid and a young man. He was in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, 3 states that actually banned, at some point or other, all blacks from coming into their states. One of Lincoln's famous early speeches, this Lyceum speech, he referred obliquely to Elijah Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist editor who was chased around the state, and his printing presses were destroyed and thrown in to the Mississippi, and eventually he was lynched. How do you get from there to abolishing slavery? Well, part of it is having a movement of purists who are totally unreasonable rise up and edit magazines and newspapers and give speeches, guys like William Garrison, who burned the Constitution as a pact with the devil because it accommodated slavery. And these were guys who were ultimately absolutely right, and we'd agree with pretty much everything they said today and think it was correct, but their methods were extremely polarizing, and if the Republican Party had entirely associated themselves with their methods, they would have gotten nowhere. But you needed them to push the envelope, and when you had the Kansas-Nebraska crisis, you actually had representatives of this kind of sentiment go into Congress. And they were unreasonable as well. They were hell on Lincoln. They hated him. They beating him about the head and shoulders all the time. And I think that was an important element of Lincoln's ultimate political success, because everything he did, they were the forerunner to it, and they pushed him along to do it. But then, if you had just done that, you would have lost the border states, because they would have pushed for emancipation too early. You needed also Lincoln, who was a statesman, who was always very carefully putting one foot in front of the other to see whether the ground under him was sound. And when you had the combination of all these unreasonable people and the statesman, Abraham Lincoln, ultimately you achieved the change you wanted to get. I look at, and obviously, I don't want to compare any of these guys in Congress to abolitionists, but they do want a transformational change. It is not their job to be, quote-unquote, reasonable by the terms that most people would, by the definition that most people would give to that term. They really should be pushing the envelope. But at the end of the day, you need that statesmanship element. Reagan represented it as well. Liberals love quoting Reagan and pointing to the times when he compromised or when he took half the loaf. So you need both of those elements. So at the moment, conservatives, they don't have this presidential type. They don't have this Lincoln type. What you have is this movement represented mainly in the House with a lot of guys who are new to this, and you don't have the statesmanship element. Now, John Boehner is trying within his limits to kind of provide that, and ultimately I think he probably is going to prevail. But in the long term, I think it takes a president to kind of take some of the edges off, to really grasp with what's practical and what's not. And but for the moment, I don't want them to be reasonable, but I do want them, quote unquote, reasonable. I do want them to realize that it's very foolish to have your tactics and your means be destructive of your ends. And if they really were going to push this beyond the deadline, that's what I fear they'd be doing.
Well, I'd love to see more prominent conservatives say what you just said. And I'll push you on a few points there. You talked about substantive differences between Birchers and Tea Partiers, and you're absolutely right, but I'd also point to the substantive differences between, say, Social Security and slavery. The kind of unreasonableness dealing with slavery, I think, is not called for when dealing with programs that enjoy broad national support, like Social Security, agriculture subsidies, student loans, whatever. You may think, and I may agree with you, that there's a case for cutting or reforming those things. But there is nothing conservative about the idea that a small minority in the United States, not even speaking for a majority of the Republican Party, can come along and push through overnight reforms that essentially relitigate the New Deal and the Great Society. And although you're right that maybe that's Tea Partiers' role to do that, to agitate for that, I think the reason we have a conservative movement in American society is to put the brakes on radicalism, including right-wing radicalism, and to say, wait a minute, after 50, 60, many of these cases, more than 100 years, these programs are woven into the fabric of society. We're not getting rid of them overnight. I think on the substance, folks at places like National Review, if there are any Burkean conservatives left over there, ought to be pushing back and say, look, we don't like everything the way it is, but it's just not right for radicals to take over the conservative movement. So I'd like to hear more from Burkeans.
Well, a couple things. One, I don't, with that comparison to abolitionism, I don't mean to suggest that the cause of conservatives at the moment should command the universal moral assent the way abolitionism does in retrospect. It's just kind of a template for how you forge far-reaching change over the long term. And I think you're being a little unfair and in your characterization, because the guys in the House, what is the content of their radicalism? They voted for the Ryan plan, basically unanimously. And what does it do? It doesn't touch Social Security. It does transform Medicare in a fundamental way, but not for 10 years. So it was really putting a stake in the ground for a different vision for our government and how entitlements are going to work. So it's not overnight. I would object to the characterization that it's radical, and you're going to have to build a mandate for it, and a key piece of that will be winning in 2012. So what we're constantly urging conservatives in the House is be patient. You're not going to. I think obviously you're not going to win this thing in a great, brilliant tactical maneuver in the course of 1 week. I mean, that is just foolish, and that's what some of them think is going to happen in the debt limit fight. But if you're not, you shouldn't confuse Burkeanism with just a absolute commitment to the status quo. These programs need to change. They should change, and they'll never change unless someone is out there pushing the envelope for change. And that's what they did with the Ryan budget. And again, I don't think the Ryan budget is radical.
I'll give you the importance of making proposals that are substantively move the debate. I'm a gay marriage supporter. When I started that debate, people told me I was just insane to even talk about it, and look what's happened.
Right.
But there's also procedural radicalism, and that's when you stop the whole system way before the country's ready for that kind of change. It's going to take, I love a lot of what's in Ryan's plan. I don't agree with all of it, but it's a 5-10 year process to get the public where Republicans want to take them. You can't do it right now, and I think conservatives ought to be saying so. But anyway, I suppose you got my point on this.
Yeah. What was that? Well, I think there are kind of three kinds of conservatism, or three elements of conservatism that ideally the sweet spot is achieving all three of them. One is kind of a very basic kind of cultural or civilizational conservatism, the way I think of it, which is just honoring certain bounds of civility and respect in how you treat others. The second is just the honoring the conservatism of the American public, which generally is not in favor of radical change unless they're truly radical in dire circumstances. And the third is the ideological element. A modern conservatism, contemporary American conservatism, does believe in limiting government. And my ideal is you do it in a way that's civil. You do it in a way that doesn't scare the horses, with the American public. But you stay true to the long-term ideological goal. And if you're doing all three of those things, as I would argue Reagan did, I know sometimes it can seem parodic how how conservatives are constantly hearkening back to Reagan, but I think that's one of his key lessons.
I completely agree about Reagan. I think one of the problems with the Tea Party movement is it's got Reagan backwards. He was not their kind of caricatured radical conservative at all. He was very cautious. He spent his second term trying to get an arms deal with Mikhail Gorbachev. He raised taxes many times. He was a cautious incrementalist in many ways in terms of how he governed, while also understanding the importance of ideas. I wish we had that kind of conservatism now. I'd be a lot more comfortable. And, you know, I'd love to see more mainstream conservatives blowing the whistle and saying, guys, what you guys are out there doing right now, about to maybe decapitate a Republican leader for trying to act like a grown-up, recognized political reality. This is not good. This is not helpful.
Well, two things. One, I mean, a lot of us have been saying it, just on the Boehner deal. The Wall Street Journal editorial page has said it. Bill Kristol has said it. We have an editorial that posted right before we started our conversation that says that. And again, I don't want to get too temporal here, because this could be old news overtaken by events by the time anyone sees this, but the word out of the Republican conference right before we started our conversation as well is that Republicans were rallying around Boehner's plan, realizing it's imperfect, but it's the only thing that has a practical chance to actually reduce some spending together with a debt limit increase. So I think your interpretation might be a little too dire. We'll see. And just one last point on
right.
Reagan. I think it's wrong to characterize Reagan as cautious. I would say he was bold yet pragmatic. And, you know, he really did, he didn't accept the existence of the Soviet Union. He always thought it would collapse. And a respectable opinion at the time thought that was ridiculous.